Hello, I'm Bill Elliott. I'm a member of the board of the Texas Board of Legal Specialization. I'm here today on behalf of the Board of Directors of TBLS and our chairman, David Dixon of Waco, to bring you an interview with our recently retired Executive Director, Gary McNeil. Gary has led TBLS for over 30 years. And during that time, we've seen an extraordinary growth in the idea of legal specialization. And his administration of this board has been exemplary. Today we're going to talk about his career, how he got started, the growth of TBLS, legal specialization, and his observations about the practice of law in Texas. We're here to honor Gary McNeil for his long years of service for us, Texas lawyers. I hope you enjoyed the film. Thank you very much. Gary, thank you for joining me today. We're here to honor you. This is from the board of TBLS, and I'm on their behalf asking you about your life and career because of your extraordinary 31 years of service to the Texas Bar and to TBLS in particular. It's a little hard sometimes to not think of TBLS as a bar function, right? It's a separate entity.
Yes.
But to me, it's still a bar function.
Right.
So I guess you think of yourself as a bar person.
I really do. I think I worked there previously in other capacities, but with the close ties that we've had with Texas Bar CLE and the Information Technology Office, always have thought, and Disciplinary Council too, I've always thought that we're part of the bar.
Yes. What's extraordinary to me is how you started in 1985.
Yes.
At TBLS.
Yes.
And how far it's come. When you sit and reflect on the 30 years of growth of the idea of specialization,
yes,
together with the growth of specialization, it's really something. How do you think about that 30 years in the issue of the growth of specialization? Does it surprise you?
In a sense it does. It's certainly gone by quickly, but in a sense it does mean a lot of growth. A lot of growth has taken place. We were a paper-driven system in 1985, and my, how that's changed, along with the rest of the world.
Indeed.
But I think the continued interest in the program and the desire for lawyers to take a step up has been the one constant and always continued to impress me.
I guess you could think of the CLE function and the specialization as sort of hand in glove, people pursuing excellence, higher levels of knowledge, greater distinction in their practice, that sort of thing.
I think that's absolutely correct. CLE is a major component of certification, certainly, and interestingly enough, the certification program was in existence 10 years, requiring people to take X number of hours of continuing legal education before the MCLE requirement was imposed. So we had a couple of thousand lawyers who were already well conditioned and really pretty appreciative of the CLE component. No complaints there, really.
Let's take a little bit of your background in terms of your upbringing.
Sure.
Take us through your formative years, your parents, where you grew up, and so on.
Surely. My dad worked for Exxon and then was called Humble Oil, and we first lived in Katy, Texas, and then Belleville, and then Tomball, all close to Houston. All were Humble Oil towns, and I graduated from high school in '66, Tomball High School. Graduated from Baylor in 1970, and then started law school at the University of Texas in fall of 1970.
So, you think of yourself maybe as a small town person?
I really do. I really do. There's always that kind of that core presence there.
Did you graduate from Tomball?
I did.
What was the size of your graduating class?
59 people. And interesting story, at least to some, I was sixth in that class, and the 5 ahead of me all got scholarships to college. I was the dividing line there. But we had we had a good class, good students, and it was a lot of fun and really good learning experience in high school.
And then what was your college experience?
Well, I was pre-med, but I think the chemistry labs kind of called me in a different direction. I changed my major to history, and I started actually thinking about, my junior year, I started thinking about going to law school. And of course, Baylor has a law school, but I felt like Texas was the top of my list. I felt like I needed a change of pace, and I wanted to go to Texas if at all possible, and I got in.
So let's see, you graduated from high school what year?
73.
So you were therefore in law school in 77 or 8?
I'm sorry, I graduated from Baylor in 70, entered law school in 1970, and graduated from law school in 73.
73?
Yes.
All right. Now, what were your influences to become a lawyer? Did you know lawyers? Did you have people in your family that were lawyers?
I had worked for an attorney cleaning his office in Tomball, and I knew 2 other attorneys there pretty well. One lived just down the street from us, but I think it was more of the interest in the intellectual challenge and the fact that we are a society of laws, and how a lawyer can influence and help individuals. So I think that's what intrigued me the most.
I think of UT during that time as the dean being Keaton.
That is correct.
And of course, an iconic figure in his own right.
Yes, indeed.
Of course, as a law student, you don't really appreciate the law school administration. You're just there to get along. How did you find the law school experience?
It was kind of a survival test, in a sense. Somebody told me going in that you have to view it as a marathon, and you just kind of keep putting one foot in front of the other. I had some really wonderful classes and wonderful professors. Some not so much, but I think it was a good experience. But I was ready to get into the real world.
So when it came time to graduate and take the bar exam and then get ready to
Yes.
go look for work, what options did you think about?
Well, I was not in the top 10% of my class, and as a friend of mine and I compared notes, and I said that does mean that does leave 90% of the people in law school. As he says, by my calculations, yes. So I was in the 90%. I really didn't know. I thought about going back home. That didn't quite pan out. I really wanted to stay in Austin like everybody else, and was just fortunate enough first to find part-time work at the state bar. They needed some research done on a particular issue, and then once I got my foot in the door, I kind of came back and said, okay, what else do you need me to do? And
So the
I
state
stayed
bar
there.
in 1973,
Yes.
we didn't have a building like we do now.
Nothing like that. The one-story building on the same site, but it was just a one-story building. It had a little add-on part in the back that was kind of like a temporary building. But yeah, that was it. That little one-story building.
And who was the executive director?
H.C. Pittman was the executive director. I worked for Davis Grant, who was the general counsel, was a great mentor to me. And I think there were about 25 employees at that time, something like that.
And today it would be under 300 employees, 260, something,
About
something
that,
like that.
yes.
Mhm. And then, of course, the bar did not have external organizations directly granted from the Supreme Court much. They didn't have legal specialization. They didn't have discipline outside the bar itself.
That's correct.
So the bar was sort of it.
It was pretty self-contained. The days before specialization, before a separate Office of Disciplinary Counsel, before the Equal Access to Justice Foundation, all of those things were yet to come.
Of course, you would know all the employees because it's so small.
Yes, absolutely.
So was this a full-time undertaking at first?
At first, well, it was, but on an hourly basis, and then later on, after I passed the bar, and Mr. Grant requested the board to add another disciplinary attorney, then that's primarily what we did. But we were the Office of General Counsel, and we really did a lot of the functions of corporate counsel and
Were you the second lawyer?
No, I was not. There was two other lawyers, excuse me, there at the time. So I was the third. I was the third one, third assistant to Mr. Grant.
So without belaboring it too much, it just suffice to say, all the grievances went through this office.
Yes, that's correct.
Did you have an occasion to think about the issue of specialization? I guess in the late 60s, the bar's professional development program sort of started up and the forerunner to CLE.
Right.
But what was your perceptions of both CLE and the idea of specialization at that time?
It was interesting. Probably the prevailing concept, profession-wise, at least what was stated publicly, was, well, the lawyer's a generalist and should know a lot about a lot of different subjects. I think the more I worked even at disciplinary counsel's office, the more I saw that people limited their practices or concentrated their practices in certain areas. And then I was generally aware of the bar's efforts to formally recognize specialization. I didn't do a lot of direct work on that 73, 74. That had already started, but I didn't do a lot of specific work on that. But I was aware of that the program was getting up and running.
How did your affiliation with Texas Bar CLE start?
I had left the bar. I was gone for a couple of years. I was in private practice, and then I worked as disciplinary counsel for the Board of Public Accountancy, which was an interesting experience. And at that time, Texas Bar CLE had an opening. A friend of mine, Steve Lee, who I'd worked with in the General Counsel's office, called me, and then I spoke with Gene Cavan, and Gene put on a good sales pitch, and so I decided to go back to the bar, but in the capacity of planning CLE programs, and work with Pat Nestor.
Of course, we see Mr. Cavan's name on plaque,
Yes.
the Cavan Award,
Yes.
but many of us did not have the benefit of knowing him.
Right.
How important was he to the notion of CLE in Texas?
Critical to that notion. I think he had a vision for continuing education long before many other people had a vision. He acted on that vision. He really got the program. He had started it already, but he realized the potential was there for some growth, which indeed has been exponential since the time he started.
So we think of you as always having been there,
Right.
but Pat Nestor was there when you got there.
Pat was there. Yes, he
So
was.
he really has always been there.
He pretty much has. 1979, I think, is when he started working for Texas Bar CLE, and I began working with him in the summer of 1982. So he'd already been there 3 years. So yeah, he really.
Perhaps it's fair to say Pat Nestor was born and then became associated with CLE right out of diapers.
I think that's a pretty accurate statement.
So your function at Texas Bar CLE was planning the seminars,
Right.
Going to the seminar site itself,
Yes.
handling the logistics of the
Yes.
administration of the programs.
Right. Right.
No on-camera work?
I really didn't do any on-camera work. We were still doing practice skills courses then, and we did do a couple of videos for the practice skills courses, which were for beginning lawyers. But I was behind the camera on that. We used some other lawyers for that.
Were you enjoying your work?
I was. I really did enjoy. I think one of the things, it's interesting, even in the disciplinary end of things, but I came into contact with so many fine lawyers, and that continued even more so. I did in the disciplinary process with the grievance committee volunteers, the continuing education volunteers, all of the authors, all of the work that people put in on that. Just really, you're dealing with the cream of the crop, and it was a fabulous experience.
It is obvious to people like you and me, but it might not be obvious to some people viewing this, that so much of the bar functions is run by volunteers,
Absolutely.
including all the teachings, all the courses, all the rest. Nobody's getting paid to do that. The paid staff makes sure it runs right, it's administered correctly. That it's a lot of work just to get the thing to run smoothly, and it's so smooth that we sometimes forget that there can be difficulty, but it's a testament to how professional the staff is, that it's been just without blemish.
Well, I thank you for a compliment as it pertains to me, but I would agree with you. Some really excellent people, very intelligent people at the bar over the course of years, and it requires a partnership between the staff and the volunteers, and neither could manage without the other. And when that partnership works, as I think it has in CLE and in specialization too, it's a good feeling.
How did the idea of you going to work for specialization arise? You had indicated it was in existence while
Yes.
you were over at Texas Bar CLE.
Yes, it was, I didn't realize that the TBLS executive director, when I worked for Texas Bar CLE, was John Roberts. I really didn't realize that he had decided to leave and go into a business venture, and his top assistant, Lynn Scott, told me about that there was going to be an opening, and then Bob Thomas from Dallas was the TBLS chair at that time, and he contacted me also and encouraged me to apply for the job, and so that meant a lot. And as Bob and I talked a little bit, he said, you know, you've got with the disciplinary background, with the CLE background, I mean, you've got those are two really important parts of what we do, and you know, I think you'd be a good fit. Now, he said, of course, now I'm one vote, and there were others that that applied, but so I decided to apply, and the rest is history.
So you actually began, I believe, in September the 1st, 1985?
September 1st, 1985.
And then looking back, you had actually, so that's 31 years, or almost 32, 31 and a half years, 31 years to when you retired, but that's from TBLS.
Yes.
When you count your bar service prior to TBLS at the
Right.
bar itself, how many more years would that amount
It's
to?
about 9 years total.
Yes.
Six in General Counsel's office and 3 in Texas Bar CLE.
So it's 40 years.
40
of-
years, yes.
Did you interview the board of TBLS, or did you interview the board of the bar?
I interviewed with the TBLS board, and I think 8 of the 9 were present. They actually were in town for a scheduled meeting. They had other business too, but part of the agenda was interviewing candidates. So yeah, I interviewed directly with
And Bob
TBS board.
Thomas chaired the board.
Bob Thomas was chair. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Of course, Bob has been such a leader of the bar for so
Surely,
long
surely.
in so many different contexts, Dallas and Texas. He has great memories. When we've talked before this interview, you mentioned some of the other people who were active and in the leadership position, including John Nichols,
Yes.
Henry Kendall, Oliver Hurd.
Harry Tyndall, and
Harry
was that Oliver Hurd, John Backey from San Antonio, Bob Mabus from Dallas, who was a labor lawyer here. I think Bob passed away a few years ago. Yeah, some really good people who had been really active in their individual fields also.
Did you have a sense of the staff of TBLS when you came on? Of course, we're blessed today looking back with some staff members who've been there about as
Yes.
long as you have.
Yes.
And
yes.
so, but what was the situation when you took the job in terms of the staff?
We had 3 people. One who was a new hire. Rosanna Arnold was the receptionist, and then Lynn Scott was there, and Lynn had been there almost since the program started in 1975. There may have been a few month lag there, but she basically had been there about almost 10 years. And the other person was Vicki Jowert, who had been there 3 or 4 years by that time. So we had some good seasoned hands there, thank goodness, for me. And so I felt like we were in pretty good shape, staff-wise.
How did you view your agenda? Your first day, your first week, your first month, and you start looking at what you have here. Did the board give you an imprimatur, go forth, let's grow, we have an ambition to do this or that? Did you think the initiatives came from you? What was your vision of that?
Well, there were a lot of things. The first feeling was one of being overwhelmed, but once I got over that, there were...
It's sort of like you've got 5 minutes to be overwhelmed. Okay,
Exactly.
now get to work.
Now it's time to go to work. Yeah. As I mentioned previously, it was all a paper-driven system, and you had paper applications, and we had applications for CLE credit. That was all paper, and so the first thing was kind of getting a handle on all of the paper and getting it flowing in the right direction. And then I think beyond that, it was getting a sense of where the program could go from that point. Once I kind of acclimated myself, then it was okay. How should should we go forward? And the board pretty much said, you know, we want you to take us the direction, you know, you think. They did, and I don't mean to say it was all my ingenuity that went into it. It was not, because we had a lot of the board members were people who really had the long-range view and knew that we had a program that was going to need to be sustained. You're going to have to bring in new people, and so it was kind of like they said, okay, go forth.
Were you in the bar center?
Yes, was in Texas Law Center. Mm-hmm.
By then, the building we know now had been constructed?
Yes, yes. It was actually built and finished in 1976.
What was the status of the specialization? I know we're reaching back in time, but
Right.
do you recall about how many specialties there were at that moment in time?
We had,
Tax probably was.
tax was a relatively new. I think it came online in '83.
Yes, that's my recollection.
We had personal injury, civil trial, estate planning, criminal, family, labor. Immigration had come along in '79.
Well, that covers a lot of the practice areas, of
Yes.
what I call the major practice areas.
Right. Real estate was also in existence, relatively new.
Well, today, of course, the funding for TBLS largely comes, it's self-funded,
Yes, it is.
as opposed to grants from the Supreme Court or the bar,
Right.
it's self-funded. But
Right.
back then, when you had a smaller universe, was it still self-funded?
It was still self-funded. Looking back through some of the historical files in the office, there's the stipulation from the bar was that they would give the specialization program seed money, if you will, $50,000 to get started, with the understanding that would be repaid, interest-free, but it would be repaid. And they felt like because it was a voluntary program, that mandatory dues should not support it. It should be self-supporting, and it was.
When you looked around the United States, what was your awareness of specialization among other bars around the country? We always, in Texas, think of Florida, for example,
Yes.
as one of our closest compared bars,
Right.
as opposed to California or New York. But
Right.
what was your perceptions about how Texas fit?
Right. I knew that Florida and California both had active programs. I really didn't know of many other states beyond those two. I knew that they had that they were both active, and that Florida was probably the closest cousin to us. California was in a little bit different situation with just because of the politics between their court and their bar and bar board of governors and their board of specialization and everything was a little bit different. Florida was more akin to ours.
Did you have the feeling that all initiatives and ideas and forward progress was self-generated? You weren't looking for Florida or anybody else to give you ideas. You pretty much were creating your own ideas.
In one sense, but also, and that was one of the benefits of having those two programs up and going, was I consulted with my colleagues from California and Florida quite a bit. Sometimes they would have established an area already that we hadn't yet established, and or they had done it in a little different configuration than we had done. So we did a lot of comparing notes and talking about what worked, what didn't work, what kind of ideas we thought would really help move the program forward.
Was your assessment that the administration of specialization, when you joined as executive director, was running well?
Yes, that was my sense, that it was pretty well organized and had the active staff that was helping with the different volunteer groups that we we depend on. So I mean, there was certainly a system and a working system that was in place.
You mentioned a minute ago one of the functions was counting CLE hours.
Yes.
Help me remember history. I mean, I was alive, right, during this
You
time.
You were.
But I actually am a little vague on MCLE and the relationship of that to this.
Right. When the specialization program started, the application was a monster application. It's still on legal size paper, so there are a few of us around who still remember legal size paper and paper. But you had to vouch for, you had to say, okay, and list by hand or typing in a form. I went to the advanced family law program from this, then it was for this many hours. And so all of that was filled out on a paper form and sent in. That was from the applicant's standpoint, individual applicants. And then the TBLS office reviewed the CLE offerings to determine whether they would be given credit in tax, estate planning.
When
family
did
law, et cetera.
MCLE start?
It started, I believe, in 1985. So
About the
specialization.
time you started
About the time I started.
running TBLS,
Yes, yes,
it started.
yes.
Prior to MCLE, we didn't count hours? I don't remember.
No, we didn't. Now, we had the State Bar College also had come along before MCLE. So you, as an attorney, you had to report, if you were certified, you reported once to your CLE hours, once to TBLS, and once to the Bar College. After MCLE came along, you added a third reporting, and that was to MCLE, and that was all done by paper initially. So you.
But the idea
Yes.
that you would have 15 hours a year or 30 hours a year really was not a particularly well-known idea before MCLE,
That's right.
unless you were in the college or at TBLS.
That's right. Unless you were certified, and so it really was, still is, quite a mark of distinction from continuing education standpoint, because certified attorneys are getting more and
Double.
always have
Double.
than rank
Well,
and file.
what is the relationship between the fact that the college and TBLS were counting hours, setting minimums, in the idea to form MCLE? Was that an influence?
Well, I think it was. There was quite a movement nationwide then for MCLE requirements. Many states were thinking we need to have that as a requirement for licensed attorneys. And I think in Texas, I think between the certified attorneys and the attorneys who were members of the college, they jumped on board saying, yeah, that's no problem. Several certified attorneys said, oh, I've built CLE into my yearly schedule, and not only is it not a problem, it's something I really look forward to and something I need to do to keep on top of my subject.
I wonder how MCLE would have developed if there hadn't been a college, if there had not been TBLS.
I wonder about that too, because there was some opposition, as you might expect. I mean, if any proposition that deals with lawyers, proposed by lawyers, is going to meet opposition, of course. And there were some opposition to MCLE. I think there would have been more opposition to that. Maybe it still would have passed, or maybe it would have been implemented by the court by rule instead of by referendum.
Again, going from memory, I think the whole idea of CLE in Texas Bar came into being in the late 60s. I don't think it's been with us
That's correct.
that long ago. My dad was from Sherman, and he was on the committee, Professional Development Committee with
Yes.
Harris Morgan from
Yes.
Greenville.
Yes.
And I recall Mr. Morgan coming over to Sherman and talking to Dad, and them talking about the idea of professional education
Yes.
training.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
even 85 seems like recent years, but I mean 68. Anyway, that's interesting. So was your vision from the start to take your base and start trying to define other areas of specialization? Was that one of your ambitions?
It was, and the board members in the initial board said, well, we want to be open to developing new areas. We don't think we have everything covered, but we want to approach that carefully and make sure that we take all the right steps before recognizing an area. But it, very definitely, I remember discussions with the board that they didn't think that all the areas were locked up. They realized there were others to come.
Now, as an overlay, the introduction of computers.
Yes.
I feel like a sociologist, historian,
You are.
historical sociologist.
Yes.
When do you recall computers became the norm in administering this paper flow?
The first time, this will date us too, was when the bar used a Wang system. If anybody remembers Wang, not many people do, but the first information technology department director was one of the things we talked about initially was the idea of CLE reporting, and he said it makes no sense to report once to TBLS, once to the college, once to MCLE. We need a unified reporting system. That was one of the first things that we worked on from a computerization standpoint, and then a lot of other stuff came along after.
What would
after
you
that.
say by 1990 it was computerized?
We were, yes, we had some functions computerized then. I believe that we got our network and website up and going initially in 1995. But we transitioned from the Wang to personal computers between 90 and 95.
Again, not all that long ago.
Not that long ago.
Now, would you say the initiative for computerization came from the bar itself, MCLE, TBLS? I mean, where was the push? Were all of you pushing at the same time together?
I think everybody, I think everybody was pushing together. I think that, with the bar and the many sections that the bar has, some of the sections had really gotten into technology in a bigger way than the bar organization per se. But I think all of us realized the potential that was there and the way that we could improve our function and overall do a better job. Also realizing that our clientele were getting more and more comfortable using computers in all aspects of life.
I know the TBLS budget is a little tight. You got to really watch your pennies.
Right.
Bar budget's tight. Everything's tight. It's a highly efficient operation. There's not a lot of largesse running around. So
Right.
Did you recall having any concerns over the capital requirements?
Initially, we felt like for our, we got personal computers, and I don't know what the individual workstations cost then, But the bigger impact, capital-wise, was once we embarked on establishing our website and making a good website. There was more behind-the-scenes support that had to come into place so we could do that, and that's where it became part capital, and then part was what programming was going to cost to do the things that we wanted to do with the website.
What was your relationship or interaction with the bar itself, or Texas Bar CLE? Now, let's say we're in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
Things are moving along fairly smoothly.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have much of an occasion to deal with Big Bar and Texas Bar CLE?
We did. We always, the whole annual budget process the bar goes through, that TBLS was viewed as a, now I can't remember the term, separate revenue fund. Anyhow, it was a special revenue fund. And so we dealt with budget issues and worked with IT, but also with Texas Bar CLE a lot.
What would your budget be part of the bar budget when presented to the Supreme Court, or did you have a separate budget submission?
It was a separate budget, kind of like an appendix to the big bar budget. Say, okay, here's the state bar budget, and here's the, okay, now this is the special revenue fund, and there were other special revenue funds.
So when they went over to the Supreme Court, when the leadership went over to present the budget, you would go?
Didn't always, did occasionally, but not always, and but was there to answer. I would be there, would always be available to answer any questions, but for the most part, I really didn't get many.
Well, that
specific
dovetails
questions.
into my next question. Your glide path seems so smooth. In the years when I was in state bar leadership, of all the issues we talked about and thought about, it was not TBLS. We had disciplinary revamp. The sunset
Right.
was in the mid-90s,
Right.
and then pushing 2000, early 2000s. Sunset was always introducing management issues they felt needed changing and so on.
Right.
And disciplinary, through the leadership of Mark White from Amarillo,
Right,
extraordinary person.
right.
Closed offices, changed the entire focus, reorganized Texas discipline. But meanwhile, TBLS just keeps on running, no problem.
We were fortunate to be under the radar a lot, but I mean, there was a lot there was a lot going on, but it was more of things that we needed to do internally, and then also we looked for opportunities to cross-market, if you will, with other bar departments. For instance, we developed the board-certified logo, and this was later, but this is give you an indication of what. Well, of course, the legislature had imposed the requirement of an attorney profile for all Texas attorneys. So we worked with the website folks at the bar and said, okay, well, how about if that board certified logo shows up on the attorney profile for certified? Oh, sure, we can do that. So we looked for ways to cross-market and try to enhance the value of certification. Just wanted to be aware of those things. But we had some, we had some, internally we had some significant projects too. But
So through the decade of the 90s, approaching the 2000s, what was your internal staff profile look like? Again, some of the people that are there today
Yes.
have been there for a long time. So did you find
Yes.
your TBLS staff stabilizing?
It did. It really did. We had two people who came shortly after I did are still with TBLS, so Odessa Bradshaw and Denise Schumann. And then we brought, Lynn was still there. So at one time we had, so there was me, Lynn, Odessa, Denise, Rosanna, and one other. So we had seven probably, because we had, we've had a receptionist also. But
When did you move out of the bar center?
Golly, that was in, I think it was 1990.
So it was
I
early
think-
in your time.
Early in my time, we moved out.
And what was the motivation for that?
Space, or lack thereof, in the law center, and also related to that, the parking in the parking garage beneath the law center was
Tight.
getting pretty tight. Yeah. So. Disciplinary council, we moved out of the bar building with, we paid rent when we were in the bar building, by the way. TBLS did pay rent in keeping with the self-funding philosophy. So disciplinary council, the books portion of the publications portion of Texas Bar CLE and TBLS moved out in 1990.
Many Texas lawyers do not appreciate what budget discipline goes on inside the State Bar of Texas.
That's true.
It's tight,
It is.
well maintained, has been forever. So you were up, TBLS is up far north, but did you have an intermediate stop where you were close to the bar center?
Yes, we were just 2 blocks away over in the, I'm not sure what the bank building is now. It was the Wells Fargo Bank.
Nearby.
One time, nearby. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Disciplinary council moved out.
Disciplinary council.
Bar books.
Bar books.
And you guys.
Mhm.
Okay. So on the issue of glide path being even,
Yeah.
do you recall any particular years where you had, say, a budget deficit or anything that was particularly challenging for one reason or another?
Yes, I do. And we had a couple of things that come to mind. We of course didn't really tried to keep the board informed on where we stood with regard to fees, because the board, at least my approach to them was, well, I don't think we should charge more than we need to maintain the organization. But we had gotten to the point, and we had the board had discussed the idea of that the annual fees were going to have to be upped at some point, and so we were getting to a point where we had run a slight annual deficit a couple of years, and so we had to deal with that and take steps to deal with that, which we did.
Did you ever incur significant advertising expenses? You had made mention of perhaps developing a website, a more robust website, and maybe extending the outreach a little further, but would that have resulted in advertising expense that was a factor?
The main advertising expense, which led into the budget issues around 2000 or so, was that TBLS members, to a person, really wanted to do some public information campaign, and we ended up producing some television ads that
Promoted the
run.
idea of hiring a board certified
Yes,
lawyer.
yes. And and the production wasn't so expensive, but the buying the TV time was.
Was that the right decision?
I think so, because I think if nothing else, and from what we've heard from some of our certified attorneys over the years, was that they said, well, that's great. You know, if you do, I don't mind paying dues if you can give us some publicity about what we've accomplished. So yeah, I think so.
Well, back to the relationship of TBLS to other states. So we're in, say, 2000. Now we're in the decade of the 2000s. You're expanding specializations, adding one ever so often. Did you have an opinion of how Texas stood in relation to Florida or California at that point? Did you feel that we were really marching forward on a faster pace than other bars? We were about the same.
I think I think we did. We were ahead, and remain ahead of other bars in a lot of ways. One of the things that we had done is just an example of the to leverage technology was the reference forms. Spent a little bit of money on the front end to get a professionally designed reference form that could be scanned, and that entered into database. Saves umpteen hours of time rather than handling all of those individually, and we were the first ones to do that. Maybe and they're not done online, but maybe the only ones to do that. They were still using the mailed out paper forms and get the paper forms back.
The system has some features I was curious about how they progressed over the years. First, the exam itself is administered by the volunteer lawyers.
Yes.
An exam committee. That's always been the case.
That's always been the case.
Then there is a council for each specialty that provides, again, volunteer lawyers act as sort of a board or a sounding board for that specialty. Has that always been a feature?
Yes. Yes.
And then the appeals section, where if you fail the exam or your application gets denied, you get to appeal it through a series of processes.
Right.
That's always been part of the system.
That has been part of it, yes.
Who gets credit for having designed those features? Exam committee, council committee, specialization council,
Right.
and then the appeals function.
Right. I think they're always, from the initial Supreme Court order, what you see in the initial Supreme Court order is that a reference to advisory commissions for the different specialty areas. I think it may say exam commissions also, but kind of the board, you do it the way that, nuts and bolts of it the way you want to, but we need a commission in a specialty area to advise the board on application standards, how to look at attorney discipline against a certified attorney, all of that.
Was there a Supreme Court justice that was the leader in thinking about these things?
I'm trying to think if, and 1974 was when the original order was entered. Chief Justice Greenhill was a part of it. I think maybe Justice Sam Johnson might have been the bar liaison leading up to the court adopting the order.
It's fairly enlightened.
Yes, yes.
The fact that kernel of an idea
Right.
on how to design it has remained constant,
Right.
even to today.
Yes, yes.
Do you think of any part of the administrative processing that has not worked as well? The idea of the exam, the idea of appealing a rejection, all those sorts of things. Has in your mind that worked correctly, or would you think now with mature system we could think about other ways of doing it?
I think overall it's worked pretty well. I think, as is always the case, the devil's in the details, and you can't design an application form that gives you a total picture on an individual. You can start to get a picture. You might get a pretty good picture in some instances, and in others you don't. So it's hard to capture some of those nuances of practice, especially in different areas that may come into play. But one reason the advisory commissions really help with that process a lot.
We were discussing off camera the idea that even specializations are interesting because the lines between this specialty and the next get a little fuzzy.
Yes.
Probate estate planning, which is one of the specialties I have, that line gets a little fuzzy.
Yes.
And so how has that come up in your years? I guess, what would be some examples
Sure.
of how these vague boundary lines come into
Sure.
play?
I think you do have. Let's look at civil trial and personal injury. Well, basically, you could say, well, personal injury is a subset of civil trial. Now, the skills are pretty transferable, but what about subject matter of suits that people have handled? Tax and estate planning to there's some overlap. There's some overlap there, and I think the two biggest issues that come into that are evaluating an application for certification. Is this person more of a tax lawyer, or is this person more of estate planning lawyer? And then also on the exams, it's something you have to constantly be diligent about, that are we covering the right subjects on the exam. The areas do change some, and okay, well, use tax and estate planning, for example. Some might be some crossover, yes. Some common areas, yes, but kind of estate planning is, maybe conservation of assets or whatever, and tax can include that, but other things, mergers, acquisitions. So it's something that keeps you on your toes.
And of course, as the law practice changes,
Yes.
it has put under pressure or focus the fundamental requirements of a certain specialty. For
Yes.
example, the decline of civil trials to a jury, particularly
Yes.
contested jury trials
Yes.
in a civil context.
Yes.
Puts pressure on the requirement that you have had a jury trial or two or three or four, whatever the requirements are.
That is correct. I think we were looking back once a few years ago on someone, I think it was on the State Bar Board, had kind of thought, well, TBLS needs to look at the requirements in this area, and kind of from the standpoint of, well, you haven't looked at these in a long time. Well, actually, they had been looked at, and I think virtually every area was revised at least a handful of times during the time I was there. I know there were some substantially revised because the practice within an area does change. It really does.
The big specialties, like family law,
Right.
they experience their own changes too. I think
Sure.
the dearth of jury trials has impacted that specialty.
Yes.
There's also the distinction between city and small town practice.
Yes.
As we know, the statistic is some 55 to 60% of Texas lawyers practice in groups of 5 or under.
Right.
Something like that.
Right.
Well, that's oftentimes a rural practice. I grew
Yes.
up in Sherman, and so I have
Sure.
an awareness of how Sherman lawyers conduct themselves. Specialization, nevertheless, hits Sherman, hits small towns.
Yes.
There are a few lawyers who always want to go above and beyond.
Right.
But has this urban versus rural distinction entered into difficulty in planning specialization? Has that been an issue?
Not so much difficulty in planning it, because I think my understanding is the reason that the required percentage of practice, look at our two of the initial areas were criminal law and family law. Well, they were chosen because a lot of people from small towns to big cities work in those areas. Percentage of practice didn't want to be, TBLS didn't want to make it too high because they didn't want to exclude the small town practitioner. Always a question of how much is enough, but the idea was that if you can meet the objective standards, it doesn't make any difference whether you're small town, mid-sized city, or metropolis. The standards can be met.
I encountered the reverse effect. The exam recertification for state planning probate says, have a probate judge attest to your expertise.
Right.
In an urban, well, in a rural town, the judges know who you are.
Yes.
As a matter of fact, I know the judges in Sherman better than the judges in Dallas. Particularly with the turnover with politics in Dallas County.
Sure.
You don't have Judge Bartlett and Judge Price and so on. In Dallas, they don't know you anymore. So the Dallas probate judges, I don't know them from hardly at all.
Right.
So that qualification needs to be re-examined.
That has to be looked at.
Because it doesn't apply so much in an urban setting.
And the practice can be different between rural and maybe you get maybe things are resolved more informally in a small town than in the city.
Yes. Not as many trials.
Not as many trials.
Or hate's a bigger factor, so there's a willingness to fight.
Right.
It can go the
exactly.
other way.
Yes.
It can go the other way.
Yes.
Well, I guess the sort of sum up this little subtopic,
Yeah.
the specialization has proved interesting, I suppose, as it still does today, because law practice changes.
Yes.
So you're always looking at the requirements, trying to figure out, are we doing the very best we can in fulfilling the objective?
It really is a constant process to decide, do we have the standards to where they are measuring the experience that really needs to be measured for somebody to qualify in this specialty area.
I guess TBLS directly reports to the Supreme Court. Over the years, has the Supreme Court said much to you about TBLS? Is their oversight been largely passive?
I guess you could say passive. There's some oversight. Justice Johnson says, well, when we don't hear about problems, that we like that. We like that we don't. But occasionally there might be an issue come up, or the court on its own has interest in a particular. But for the most part, they are very comfortable with TBLS doing the functions of certification, and really the court has never been interested, collectively or individually, in, they might ask a question, but they're not really interested in pushing for a certain outcome.
It's a little hard to use the phrase Justice Johnson and passive in the same sentence, if you know what I mean.
It is exactly. It is exactly.
He's still present today in our
Terrific
board
person.
meetings. And it's just so heartwarming, actually, to think that a Texas Supreme Court justice would take time to come out and actually watch the meetings
Absolutely.
and offer instructive and helpful comments. It's one of the strengths of our bar, I think.
I agree.
As we approach the conclusion of our wonderful talk, Gary, I wonder how you would articulate your sense of ownership and pride over what you've done.
But a couple of things. I have to again say that it's been just a fabulous experience to work with all of the quality people that I've had the pleasure to work with over the years. The volunteers have just been terrific. I've been blessed with good staff people. I've made a mistake or two along the way, but really good people who also share kind of a bigger vision of what certification is all about, and just to be able to work with lawyers who want to. Lawyers are achievers, and if given a chance, many will take the extra step. And it's been just a real pleasure to work with people who are willing to take that extra step.
It's just so amazing that it's run so smoothly, so effectively. And so I think the board's intention is to honor you by this film, and it's a subsequent viewing, and I think it's a continued, ever-present thank you.
And I would say thank you in return. So many really good board members, including you, who I've had the privilege of working with, and so it's been a real honor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.